The time is just gone 20 minutes past 9 a.m. as we continue with the broadcast this morning on News and Views. And it's time now to look at the latest developments with regards to the South African Reserve Bank being left with no choice whatsoever in increasing the repo rate. And this is as a result of rising inflation. We joined this morning by Professor Patrick Bond, University of Johannesburg's Department of Sociology. Patrick, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
It's so nice to be with you, Annette. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, against the background, a 13-year high as far as inflation is concerned at 7.4%. Does the Reserve Bank have any choice as far as the repo rate goes?
Oh, I would say yes. And I happen to work in a reserve bank for a couple of years and have seen creative central bankers around the world deal with problems that are imported. This is not homegrown inflation, aside from ESCOM. And indeed, the fear of if you kind of put the interest rates up, you'll stifle the economy at a time we are desperately in need of more economic stimulation, more jobs, more direct investment. Direct investment often relies on the interest rate as a sort of signal. And so to have maybe a 0.5% point increase when the Monetary Policy Committee meets today, or even 0.75, getting up possibly to a full percent, as the Federal Reserve in the U.S. did. That's scary because it strangles local economic initiative on the grounds that there's too much price increases from this economy, which is not the case. The price increases are imported. It's because our rand has crashed. It's now around 17. It was 14 to the dollar just a few months ago, and 15 steady for most of the year. So we're importing because inflation, because our rand is lower, and also because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that's caused, of course, so many disruptions, especially in some of the agricultural markets, things that affect us, not just grain, but also vegetable oil that comes from Europe. So we've been seeing major price increases there. But, I think it's basically the energy prices, the oil prices, and they actually have started to come down. We haven't seen it at the pump. We might next week. But the energy price, especially for imported oil, has gone through the roof. It was around $80 for the what's called the Brent crude oil price, and it went up to over $120. But today it's 106, and it's been as low as 97 recently. So I think that part of it, the excess price increase on imported oil, will actually start to ease, and so we should see lower inflation rates if that's one of the major drivers. 45% of our increases on energy, and that's not just energy for heating during the cold winter, but also energy for transport and the petrol that we need to get around. So I hope the Reserve Bank would say, looking at the fact that it's imported, not homegrown, we shouldn't strangle the economy. We should do other things, maybe strangle those who would take money out of the country by imposing tighter exchange controls, which would allow for a lower interest rate. To me, that would be the alternative.
Yes, and also interesting that you say, Patrick, strangling the economy, but also consumers are being strangled in more ways than one. And something has got to give because, these increases cannot be sustained all the time.
It's true. Most of our consumers, aside, I suppose, from those who practice Islamic banking, where there's not an interest rate, but those who are in debt are suffering the 3% increase that we've been seeing. It's actually about 1.5, but an anticipated 3% this year. And that will make repayment of our consumer credit, our housing, our car, our student loan for some, the credit card debt that people have begun to sort of see danger levels, as well as the informal lenders, the machinistas. So pushing up those interest rates from the Reserve Bank has a terrible effect on all the rest of us who are debtors. And it's really everyone, isn't it? Also, corporate debts at a relatively high level, and for the state to borrow. That's the kind of mistake that I think our central bankers typically make. They're insensitive to that sort of suffering because they're frankly elites. These are 5 people who are meeting, pretty much upper middle class or rich people themselves, and they are probably net creditors. They're not debtors, but they have more money in the bank than they owe is is a typical situation for a rich person. And I think that's one of the biases that our Reserve Bank has really had from its outset, which is exactly about 100 years old. That you put central bankers in charge who just are not grounded in the lived realities of our society.
Yes, one actually, one doesn't, one cannot underestimate the powers that these central bankers have, Patrick. And we know that, to an extent, they are at the mercy of a government as well, because one should not lose sight of that fact that a lot of our economic woes, we know there are external influences. The Russia, the Ukraine conflict is one issue, but internally as well, one mustn't lose sight of the fact that there have been many internal drivers that have resulted, or we find ourselves suffering the consequences as a result of some of the internal issues that have been playing out for a very, very long time now.
Oh, quite right, Ineat. In fact, it was quite revealing just last week that the lead Treasury official over the last 25 years, Ishmael Momayed, was on Radio 702, and he basically admitted what we've all been saying, which is that the central bank and the Treasury are asleep at the wheel when it comes to, um, let's say, putting regulations into play. There are regulations, exchange control regulations, but effectively preventing the outflow of South African funds, which then go into the hot money centers. We know this problem stems right from the top. President Ramaphosa himself, while he was the main lawman investor, promoted illicit financial flows to Bermuda for lawmen instead of paying his workers a living wage. Hence, there was a massacre exactly 10 years ago. And also, Ramaphosa was involved as the chair of MTN. He was also involved in his own company, Shanduka, using Mauritius as a tax haven. These are quite notorious cases. And I think when Ishmael Momomiat says we haven't done a very good job, he's basically reflecting the Financial Action Task Force, which is a global body that assesses whether our Reserve Bank and our Treasury are doing a good job on stopping terrorism and tax evasion and drug and other illicit activities through the banking system. They basically said, we're going to put you on a gray list. We'll know that later this year. I fear that this mentality, which is a liberalizing mentality that bankers love and our central bank has bought into, our Treasury really has bought into since the days of Gear 25 years ago, that's really done the country a terrible disservice. We lose 3 to 7% of GDP, according to Treasury, their financial intelligence center, because of these illicit financial flows. So, if you could put instead of a higher interest rate, you clamp down instead on the illicit financial flows, there'd be much more money circulating in the economy, and the fear that if you have a lower interest rate, then the hot money will run out of the country and go somewhere where it's a higher rate. Given especially that our currency is declining, you'd have a much lower fear. So to tighten exchange controls and to really crack down on the tax evasion that's occurring through illicit financial flows, that would be what I'd hope. It's not a monetary policy committee decision to do that. It's really up to the central bank governor, Lesego Kanyako, and the Treasury, the finance minister, Enoch Godongwana. I regret, even though I once taught Enoch Godongwana Das Kapital, Marx's great work. That was in 1997 when he was the leader of the Metal Workers Union. And I don't think I did a very good job because he didn't retain much of that spirit of clamping down on these illicit flows. And instead, what we saw in February is he reduced the restrictions on where funds can flow, our pension funds, insurance funds, institutional investor funds. Now, 50% can be invested abroad. So that's about 4 trillion rand. It used to be a 70% restriction. It had to be internally invested, now down to 50. And that's 4 trillion rand that Enoch Godongwana just allowed to, kind of flee the country. And I think that helps to explain this very substantial decline in the rand, about 17% decline in the rand. So these are the sorts of problems that if you've got even a fall in the oil price, which was about 12% over the last 3 or 4 weeks, because the currency is falling faster, we still are importing inflation. And I don't think by raising the interest rate, it's going to have any positive effect on inflation.
Well, clearly, and I think also the scary thought, Patrick, is when the proverbial hits the fan. And as we've seen in the case of Sri Lanka as well. And it could easily happen in a country like South Africa, and all these politicians do. And like we've seen, the president of Sri Lanka is shirk their responsibilities, just flee, run away. And we've seen, uh, out of Maldives and now safe haven in Singapore. And this is exactly what has happened as well. And it's scary that South Africa. We know we are in a volatile climate. We know what had happened last year with the unrest that had taken place in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. And you know, just I mean, how much longer can we sustain? What we are experiencing at this point in time.
I think you're absolutely right, yet because the Sri Lanka case is one where the International Monetary Fund was really squeezing, and that government, which was a corrupt government of elites, the president was tossed out. They've now tried to put the prime minister in, and that's not going to satisfy the protesters. And then they're also having to deal with the overhang of the Chinese debt. Chinese government more or less seized the major new port that was built in Sri Lanka as a sort of collateral. Now we're in a similar situation insofar as we've had major Chinese debt, but also World Bank debt, European debt, and that comes through mainly Eskom and Transnet. For Transnet, it was a corrupt relationship through the Guptas with China South Rail, 1,000 locomotives, and also in the Durban harbor, those big cranes, also corrupt Chinese and Swiss deal on that, and Chinese financing. In the case of Medupi, the World Bank made their biggest loan ever, and were joined by the export-import banks of the West, as well as the China Development Bank on Kusile, the BRICS Bank. So we're looking at these bankers really putting Eskom into debt, and they've just asked for a 34% increase in Eskom prices. Now, that will really hit people hard. You see, it's there, I think, that if you're a good government, you would say, we have several administered prices. We can control prices. We can control Eskom prices. We can control the petrol price, right, through the centralized authority. We can control water prices to ordinary consumers. These we could keep down, or for transport prices, we could give a direct subsidy, say, to combis. They get zero subsidy. We know 2 years ago there was talk of them getting subsidy so that they could bring down the occupancy in the combis during the worst COVID time to prevent so much infection. We know these mechanisms exist. And what you said is, a year ago, those began to kick in when President Ramaphosa said, now I see this extent of desperation and anger, the boiling pot now blowing, the powder keg exploding, and I'm going to give 350 rand a month to about 10 million people. It was a year ago, just after the riots in Durban, that he reinstated a grant, the 350 emergency grant, that had been taken off and contributed to this sort of powder keg. I think that's actually what a good government would do. It would say, maybe we should do as Hugo Chavez in Venezuela did, set up some shops in the townships where we'll supply state-subsidized maize and cooking oil and the basics. You can go in there and get a good quantity of the things you need at a reasonable price, and then put a freeze on electricity and maybe charge the big companies more to make up what we would call a cross subsidy, and then to deal with things like the transport crisis and the very high rise that people are facing in combis, a direct subsidy to the combis. Now, that would mean a higher fiscal deficit, but we've already gone very high last year, and I don't think that's the end of the world. We show that, especially with exchange controls, this debt can be repaid if you've got more activity at the base of the economy. So I'd rather see that sort of, let me call it an interventionist approach by a caring government than the Reserve Bank resorting to neoliberalism, while Gonagwana puts fiscal constraint, austerity on so many of our key budget priorities like healthcare and education. And so the interest rate going up today, 0.5% will just add fuel to that fire.
Well, Patrick, we're going to have to leave it at that. As always, we do appreciate you taking time out, talking to us here on Salam Media. We wish you all the best, and please take care.
Salams. Thank you very much.
Patrick Bond, University of Johannesburg's Department of Sociology, with us this morning. The time is just gone 9:34. We come back, we'll be joined by CEO at Outer, Wayne Duvenage.